Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 12 of Diabetics for Diabetics Radio. My name is Bowie Madison. I am your host. I have been a type 1 diabetic for just over 20 years now, and I'm diving into the causes and potential healing measures for diabetics to take better care of themselves. We are here at episode 12. We've made our way through thinking differently about the disease itself. Education is a huge and will play a huge role in how diabetes is healed and how it is taken care of by individuals with diabetics. Where we are today is we are kind of bridging two topics that we've covered in episode 10 and episode 11. Episode 10 was dedicated to inflammation and identifying all of the factors that are actually going on behind the scenes of the word inflammation. And episode 11 was all about iron in a healthy system, iron as a nutrient, iron as an element, and some of the characteristics that make it what it is. And I kind of left a little bit of a cliffhanger in episode 11, alluding to the potential for harm that some of the characteristics of iron um, can have in a bodily system. So that's what this episode is all about. So we're starting to connect dots now. I want to talk about iron and its role in inflammation here and how iron dysregulation increases our body's potential for reactive oxygen species and inflammation. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about what iron does and how it can contribute to increased inflammation. For starters, like I said, my name is Bowie. I have had type 1 diabetes for over 20 years. I am healing. And in my healing journey, I am sharing information as I go. Like I said, over 20 years now. And I have always been curious about the disease state, the disease condition, how it came about. And about 2 years ago, I got really serious about it and started to venture into alternative means of healing via diet, nutrition, supplementation. And I took to TikTok. That was my go-to platform, and you'll see my handle there. But I was just amazed at the amount of misinformation, misunderstanding, and general curiosity among the diabetic population. So I've decided to share. And so here we are. So, like I mentioned in the introduction, from episode 11, we learned about iron itself and what it does for a healthy cell. And it's important. It is so important. It binds to hemoglobin and aids in delivering oxygen to our cells. It aids in the cell's production of energy. Iron is incredibly reactive. And that means it's a willing donator and acceptor of electrons. That's where it plays its part in the electron transport chain of cellular respiration. So essentially, it's responsible for oxygen getting to the tissues and responsible for our cells being able to generate their own energy. So, no iron, no life. We have made that abundantly clear. Iron is very important for a healthy functioning cell. But also, like I said, kind of a little bit of a cliffhanger, but that reactivity that gives iron its potency for good in the body, delivering oxygen and delivering energy, iron in its free, unbound form can react with incorrect tissues, substrates, and molecules when it is not in balance. So if it ever finds itself in a neighborhood it's not supposed to be, or not chaperoned by a specific iron protein, things can get a little bit iffy because, as we'll find out, iron is a potent pro-oxidant. All right, so pro-oxidation. And from episode 10, if you're unfamiliar with the term pro-oxidant, I'm sure just in in living your life and kind of being a consumer in the mainstream, you've heard of antioxidants being healthy. Pro-oxidant is something that we're not a fan of because of its tie to inflammation. So from the episode before episode 11, episode 10, we talked about some of the inner workings of inflammation. And if you're unfamiliar with what inflammation actually is beyond kind of like that generic title that we've been diagnosing everything by, oh, it's inflammation. Oh, take an anti-inflammatory. I definitely encourage you to watch episode 10 to get a better understanding of how what's happening is happening. Uh, but these are just little tidbits here. Inflammation is essentially the body's immune response to an irritant. Now, that is the very, very generic description. Things to ask further after that initial answer: what is the irritant? What am I actually looking for? If you know what you're looking for, you know how you can address it. Where is this happening? When is it happening? And where did this irritant come from? So in episode 10, we learned about reactive oxygen species, or ROS, and how these little specific molecules are the key signaling molecules in the inflammatory cascade that have an important purpose, right? They're a protective cellular cascade of our immune response. So white blood cells, or those immune cells responsible for keeping us safe, there is such a thing as a polymorphonuclear neutrophils, or a PMN, and these are the first line of defense, first responders of the immune system that absorb and confiscate harmful materials. Now, after they have done this, right, they've identified the threat, they've taken care of the threat or neutralized it. What they do is they leave a reactive oxygen species where they found that invader. Now, the body knows what ROS mean. ROS are themselves very unstable and can be harmful. The body uses that ROS. ROS is like the currency of needing help, right? If you've got these all brand new invaders, PMNs kind of collect them, whatever they are. Your body may not have a natural immunity to it, but it collects it, leaves ROS, and that is the body's sign to clean up, right? So we're not just like leaving holes in tissues and missing enzymes and things like that. ROS is the universal sign in the body for things to be cleaned up after the threat has already been there. So what do ROS look like? These are the three reactive oxygen species I am particularly interested in. Superoxide, which is an oxygen molecule with an extra electron. Hydrogen peroxide, which we're all familiar with. And the hydroxyl radical, which is a hydrogen. What results from hydrogen peroxide that has been reduced and carries around that extra electron. So now it comes time to tie these two together. So how do iron and the inflammatory response interact? So like I mentioned before, iron is a high energy catalyzer. Okay, so it's there to make things happen. It's in need of a chaperone wherever it goes, whatever protein that it's never by itself, essentially, right? So I noticed this when I was reading and researching about iron, is that everyone, whenever they were talking about how special it was, they were talking about how high energy, how much it did, how it catalyzed every kind of energy producing chemical equation. And also, in the same breath, talked about how important it was that it had a chaperone protein, whether that be ferritin, transferrin, hepcidin, or ferroportin. Those are all covered in episode 10 or episode 11. And I thought that interesting. So it is high energy and makes things happen, huge reactive potential, and it needs a chaperone. So I started to think in my head, what happens if it doesn't have a chaperone, right? It's kind of like those, angsty kids that need to be like a young kid in a room, right? It needs somebody watching it because if not, you don't really know what's going to happen. So we are familiar with the reactivity of iron. However, it's not usually in our body, it's in nature. But we've seen rust. Everyone kind of knows what rust is. It is the combination of iron, oxygen, and water, right? So rust is just oxidized iron, with water being an accelerant of that reaction. So, what happens when that reactivity is introduced to the body and the inflammatory response? So, in order to kind of connect those dots and see how iron in the body could possibly translate to reactive oxygen species, we need to know two important chemical reactions. And they are Fenton's reaction or Fenton's reagent and the Haber-Weiss reaction. Okay. Now we're going to get into some chemistry here. Don't don't get lost in the sauce here. It's really um, I just need to make sure that you see reactive oxygen species and kind of how they result from iron. So here are the three steps of Fenton's reaction. So you'll see here iron, iron plus two. So that's one. The plus two and plus three are only talking about how many electrons are missing or are added to a free iron atom. Um, oops. So don't, like I said, don't get lost in the sauce. Just kind of stick with me here. Fenton's reaction starts with a free iron atom reacting with hydrogen peroxide, which then moves to. Let me uh, let me make sure I've got my notes here, right? So iron 2 oxidized, gains an electron, turns into iron plus 3, right? But in losing that electron, hydrogen peroxide has been reduced to a hydroxyl radical, which is one of those reactive oxygen species that we remember from before, and a hydroxyl or a hydroxy molecule, okay? Hydroxide ion, rather. Then iron 3 is reduced back to iron 2 with another hydrogen peroxide, right? Because um, we do have a natural low level of hydrogen peroxide in our cells as a naturally occurring reactive oxygen species, right? They're always there because they're assigned for cleanup, part of basic cell maintenance. That's another topic covered in episode 10 as well. But when you take iron 3 and hydrogen peroxide, that is reduced back to iron 2, but now it's forming another reactive oxygen species. This is called a hydroperoxyl radical. And then with even more hydrogen peroxides, the potential for these to turn into another hydroxyl radical and another hydroperoxyl radical. Okay, so you can see free iron already reacting with just a very basic ROS existing within the cell has potential to become a lot more reactive and dangerous from an inflammatory standpoint. So this is from Wikipedia. So Fenton's reagent is a solution of hydrogen peroxide with ferrous iron, which is typically iron sulfate or FeSO4, as a catalyst that is used to oxidize contaminants or wastewaters as part of an advanced oxidation process. Fenton's reagent can be used to destroy organic compounds. Okay, so this was really just in the context of the chemical equation itself. But when you start to apply these things in the body, it starts to mean a little bit more, right? So hydrogen peroxide and ferrous iron, right? So you've got hydrogen peroxide and ferrous iron. So ferrous iron is the Fe2 plus that we see combined with sulfate, which will, kind of be tossed aside in the breakdown. So as a catalyst, this is used to oxidize contaminants, right? So we've clearly seen that it has the ability to oxidize. Now, contaminants, that could be a good thing, right? If we're talking about an immune response, we know that it's reactive. That's kind of what gets the immune system fired up. But when you think about it in a bodily context, this reaction can be used to destroy organic compounds. Now, the body is one big old organic compound, right? You think of proteins, you think of tissues, things like that. Those are all organic compounds with the potential to be destroyed if Fenton's reagent is kind of turned loose, okay? And also, this is for future episodes, but I want you to remember this name, iron sulfate, right? Iron sulfate or ferrous sulfate. Ferrous sulfate is another name for iron sulfate, that FeSO4 molecule, okay? This is actually an additive in food. We'll talk about what that could mean in a little bit. So again, a lot of chemistry talk. So what the hell's going on? For those unfamiliar with chemistry, the difference between iron plus 2 and iron plus 3 has to do with the number of electrons it is missing. It simply corresponds to the reactivity and outcomes of its reaction with hydrogen peroxide, right? So iron plus 2 tends to be more reactive than iron plus 3, but both have the potential to react with hydrogen peroxide to break down into more ROS. And all of these ROS are all cues for more inflammation. Okay, so really, out of all of those 3, 4 slides, the big thing is free iron reacts with reactive oxygen species to create even more reactive oxygen species. Okay, so now that we've gone over the Fenton reaction, let's talk a little bit more about the next Haber-Weiss reaction. So again, more reactivity from iron, more oxidation, more free radicals. Okay, so now you've got that iron 3 and that superoxide anion or anion, I believe, breaks further down, and then that first reaction begets the beginning of the Fenton reaction, right? Which is that iron 2 and hydrogen peroxide breaking down into iron 3 with that hydroxyl radical. From this, right? So you've got that superoxide anion here, which is a free radical, and hydrogen peroxide, and you're getting another hydroxyl radical, right? So you have Fenton's reaction feeding the Haber-Weiss reaction. Both of those reactions are creating reactive oxygen species, which has just made a single small amount of reactive oxygen species, like hydrogen peroxide, we talked about, is a free radical, but it is relatively stable compared to the hydroxyl radical, right? So we've taken something that's relatively stable and made a lot more unstable inflammatory molecules, okay? So this generates hydroxyl radicals from hydrogen peroxide and a superoxide anion catalyzed by, you guessed it, iron. So why is this important? Okay, so all this fancy chemistry talk. Free reduced iron, which is that Fe plus 2 and Fe plus 3, is responsible for the creation of additional reactive oxygen species, or ROS. So that hydroxyl radical and the hydroperoxyl ROS via the Fenton reaction, right? So we had a couple different molecules being made. And having those created feeds into the Haber-Weiss reaction, which is the creation of an additional hydroxyl radical made by that Haber-Weiss reaction, right? So what was initially just hydrogen peroxide has now just completely broken down into 3 different kinds of added reactive oxygen species. So, I mentioned what is that hydrogen peroxide doing there in the first place? If you'll remember from episode 10, talking about inflammation, our body is not unfamiliar with ROS, right? It has a low, steady hum of ROS, just as means as keeping the cell clean, right? There's ROS in every cell. And a healthy cell has a low level of ROS. These are just byproducts of basic cell functions, right? It's like taking out the trash at the office, right? Simple, basic little stuff, just making sure that everything stays clean, but at the same time you can't have a cell function and have no waste, right? So the cell needs the trash taken out regularly. It's just a matter of degree. So in a healthy adult, that ROS load, which typically turns out to be hydrogen peroxide, signals taking out the trash to maintain a clean and orderly cell. However, in a chronically inflamed ROS load, this is the hoarder's house with the smoke blowing out the windows, right? So we've got all this trash, all this extra inflammatory ROS. What will become of that cell? So more free iron introduces a new, more reactive dynamic in that ROS disposal procedure, right? So the cell's used to this mundane, low level ROS produced by everyday cell function. But now, that little bit of trash you have in your cell that you really can't avoid has now become a fuse for a much more volatile environment. This is when you start to introduce free iron. So hydrogen peroxide is naturally more abundant in typical cell reactive oxygen species, right? It's more stable. It's able to be moved around without being so reactive. It is only reactive. Hydrogen peroxide is only reactive with very reactive compounds like iron. Um, being that it's more stable, it's able to move around the cell. Why does that matter? Because when you mix that hydrogen peroxide with iron, you have those inflammatory ROS cascades via the Fenton and Haber-Weiss reaction. So when combined with free iron, hydrogen peroxide degrades into more reactive hydroxyl radicals. We talked about that in the chemistry equations before. So that hydroxyl radical generated spontaneously from hydrogen peroxide and iron is extremely toxic and destroys any biological structure, right? So H2O2, which is hydrogen peroxide, is fairly stable, fairly compared to the hydroxyl, right? So peroxide has a longer shelf life, it is less reactive. The hydroxyl radical has a shorter shelf life. It doesn't last as long, but it wreaks havoc in the cell. It absolutely destroys anything that it comes into contact with, right? So, what does that mean for our tissues if it destroys any biological structure? I don't know, maybe DNA, maybe tissues. These are all things that can exacerbate inflammation, right? So, hydrogen peroxide, with its stability and long half life, can reach virtually any site and in the presence of free iron distribute its toxic effect all over the cell. So what was once a good thing, right? We don't want ROS being created and just instantly burning a hole in the cell, right? It's supposed to be a message to the inflammatory system that it needs to be taken care of. And its stability in the cell and lack of reactivity gives the immune system time to absorb it and get rid of it. But when you introduce free iron and you beget this hydroxyl radical, there's no time. There's no time to collect it and get rid of it, and it's more dangerous. So, in this oxidative stress scenario, hydrogen peroxide, which was at first a safety measure in not being reactive, has now become a super spreader. So, a longer lived, less reactive hydrogen peroxide serves as a super spreader, moving throughout the cell, reacting with free iron, which is in the cell now, within the tissue where it dissolves into an extremely toxic, short lived hydroxyl radical. Whew. Now, this is bad news, right? Because, like I said, hydrogen peroxide was supposed to be a good thing, right? It's not eating up the cell. It's not reacting with everything it runs into. It is waiting to be taken care of by the immune system. When you introduce free iron that does not have a chaperone, again, we'll talk more later in further episodes about how it loses its chaperone and why it's actually free in the cell in the first place. But if hydrogen peroxide happens upon free iron in the cell, this has disastrous effects for the cell. So, what was once harmless and necessary has now become completely dangerous. So, the ROS garbage removal cycle has just caught fire because hydrogen peroxide, waiting for the trash to be taken out, has now just exploded into this extremely destructive hydroxyl radical. And this is the cue for a much greater inflammatory cascade. So, when you think about the chronic inflammatory state that everyone seems to find themselves in, we just have rampant inflammation. So something in that inflammatory dynamic has gone awry where there is more inflammation than we know what to do with. And I have found that iron is the catalyst or is a catalyst for taking what was once a normal inflammatory cascade and making it something much, much more dangerous. So, a lot of information there, a lot of information there, okay? So, what we'll talk about next, right? We have learned about the potential danger of having typical reactive oxygen species and free iron in the cell. We need to figure out if we have too much iron in our cells, right? So, where are the chaperones? Where are our iron regulating proteins? Why are they not there? Why is the iron not where it's supposed to be? Right? Is this happening in the liver? Is this happening in the micro? Where is this happening? And in these states where all of these chronic inflammatory states are occurring, what does that look like for the human body, right? What's happening? What happens to tissue that is iron overloaded, right? And that's what we'll talk about in the following episodes. So I hope you learned something here. Follow and share. Okay, so this is for all diabetics. This is for anybody interested in inflammation. This is for someone you know. Okay, so like, follow, share. Know someone who this could benefit. Subscribe and invite them. Right, and I cover things in shorter form. I just kind of ask kind of meaningful questions, trying to kind of generate some sort of curiosity via my TikTok. There's my handle there. And let's keep this going. Okay, so the next episode we'll talk more about iron overload, how that affects the inflammatory cascade, and what that means for human tissue. Okay, so thank you so much for being here. I appreciate your attention. And again, the cure is on its way. We are here to learn and heal. All right, so this is Bowie Madison signing off for episode 12 of Diabetics for Diabetics Radio. Thank you so much, and see you next time.